The first batch of Epstein files have been released by the Department of Justice, and we have just quickly reviewed them. We're going to let you know what is revealed, what isn't, and where this can go from here. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. What a day. What a day. As you can tell, this is kind of an emergency sidebar. I'm not on set. We didn't know when this was going to happen. We were waiting all day for the release of these Jeffrey Epstein files, and they are out here. Now, to be clear, this is potentially only a fraction of what could come out. And we're going to go over this for you so you don't have to do it yourself. And a little fair warning here, little fair warning. It doesn't appear from our initial review that there's anything, bombshell or revolutionary, or here's the Epstein list of everybody who was involved in this potential wrongdoing. I want to be clear about that. But there's a reason for that, because it was expected, after litigation and FOIA requests and the trial of Ghislaine Maxwell, Jeffrey Epstein's accomplice, who was convicted of federal sex crimes charges and was sentenced to 20 years in prison, a lot of this material has already come out. Flight logs, manifests, address book. However, it is fascinating to see what was released here. And of course, Jeffrey Epstein was the disgraced financier, convicted sex offender who ended up dying in prison while awaiting trial on federal sex trafficking charges. But the first thing we got to talk about is the statement that was released by the Department of Justice when they released all these files. And it reads, "Today, Attorney General Pamela Bondi, in conjunction with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, declassified and publicly released files related to convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein and his sexual exploitation of over 250 underage girls at his homes in New York and Florida, among other locations. The first phase of declassified files largely contains documents that have been previously leaked but never released in a formal capacity by the U.S. government. Quote, this Department of Justice is following through on President Trump's commitment to transparency and lifting the veil on the disgusting actions of Jeffrey Epstein and his co-conspirators," said Attorney General Pamela Bondi. The first phase of files released today sheds light on Epstein's extensive network and begins to provide the public with long overdue accountability. The FBI is entering a new era, one that will be defined by integrity, accountability, and the unwavering pursuit of justice. This is from FBI Director Kash Patel, the new FBI director. There will be no cover-ups, no missing documents, and no stone left unturned. And anyone from the prior or current bureau who undermines this will be swiftly pursued. If there are gaps, we will find them. If records have been hidden, we will uncover them. And we will bring everything we find to the DOJ to be fully assessed and transparently disseminated to the American people as it should be. The oath we take is to the Constitution, and under my leadership, the promise will be upheld without compromise." It goes on to say, Attorney General Bondi requested the full and complete files related to Jeffrey Epstein. In response, the department received approximately 200 pages of documents. However, the Attorney General was later informed of thousands of pages of documents related to the investigation and indictment of Epstein that were not previously disclosed. The Attorney General has requested the FBI deliver the remaining documents to the department by 8 a.m. on February 28th and has tasked FBI Director Kash Patel with investigating why the request for all documents was not followed. The department remains committed to transparency and intends to release the remaining documents upon review and redaction to protect the identities of Epstein's victims. And by the way, in a separate letter from Pamela Bondi to Kash Patel, she said she expects a report from him in basically 2 weeks about why the files weren't turned over. Hey, by the way, we really appreciate you guys coming to us for this episode of Sidebars. We break down, this new development in the Jeffrey Epstein case. And for that, I gotta thank our sponsor, Morgan & Morgan, because with their support, it helps make episodes like this possible. Now, Morgan & Morgan, a firm with over 1,000 attorneys, do you know why? They win a lot. In the past few months, Morgan & Morgan secured a $29 million verdict for a bicyclist in Philadelphia, a $2.7 million verdict for a car accident victim in Florida, not to mention $5.6 million for a car crash victim in Georgia after insurance offered that client $0. And even if you think your case isn't worth millions and millions of dollars, why not start a claim and fight for what you deserve? And by the way, Morgan & Morgan makes it so simple. You can start a claim from your phone in just 8 clicks. So if you're injured, you can easily start a claim at forthepeople.com/LC sidebar. This is very significant. And we actually dedicated a whole other sidebar, we released it earlier today, to this very issue. But the idea that the FBI is not complying with a request from the Attorney General who oversees the DOJ and the FBI, very concerning. Now, we don't know for sure who Attorney General Pam Bondi's source is, whether that person is credible, what exactly happened here, if there was maybe a miscommunication or maybe even a deliberate attempt to not turn over the materials. But I encourage everybody to check out that other episode where I interviewed former FBI agent Colin Schmidt. You can hear his take on this, but we will see what comes of that in the meantime. And we'll see what happens tomorrow and maybe in 2 weeks with the report. But now we want to get into the documents. Okay, so first up, the flight log released as part of phase one has a note at the top, and it says it was a government exhibit publicly released in U.S. v. Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell's criminal case. And to kind of give you an idea of just how much time Epstein and others spent on his jet, it's been referred to what as the Lolita Express, the flight log is 118 pages long and only covers April 1991 to January 2006. Now, a lot of this information, as I mentioned, we've heard before, but I want to give you a few of the highlights here. So parts of this flight log are very, very difficult to read. So whether through the handwriting or the age of the photocopies, but at times, whoever's filling out the sheet also uses initials or just writes down one male or two female. So it's kind of difficult to know at times who was on the plane. Now, sometimes the description on the flight log included notes. For example, in June 1991, an entry appears to say, Herb, show plane to Reba McEntire plus husband. Okay, so that's a big name right there. You got another entry from January the next year that indicated that Epstein and Maxwell flew into Burbank to attend the Academy Awards. But look, it's safe to say that a lot of people flew on the so-called Lolita Express. The two on it the most were Jeffrey Epstein, of course, and Ghislaine Maxwell. But there were other famous names as well. President Donald Trump's name appears several times in the early 90s. A May 1994 log entry says Jeffrey flew with Trump, Trump's then wife Marla Maples, their daughter Tiffany, and Tiffany's nanny. Another time in 1995, Eric Trump was listed as a passenger. Prince Andrew's name appears in an entry from February 1999. The prince has previously gotten in a lot of hot water over his connection, his friendship with Jeffrey Epstein, which continued even after Epstein was convicted of sex crimes. That always seemed to be the allegation. Former President Bill Clinton also makes several appearances in the early 2000s on the flight log. He flew multiple times in 2002, accompanied by multiple Secret Service agents each time. You have an entry from August 2002 that lists Virginia Roberts, now called Virginia Giuffre, a victim of Epstein and Maxwell, who pushed forward with a lawsuit against the apparent madam, leading to, by the way, all these documents, or a lot of these documents, being released during Maxwell's eventual criminal trial. But another exhibit included in phase one of the document release may not look like much at first glance. It's fully redacted, but this list is entitled Masseuses, and with a note saying redacted to protect potential victim information, it has 254 line items. So while it's unclear whether any of the names might be repeated, it is a staggering number of women and girls who may have been subjected to sexual assault, because we all remember what the allegations were, that Jeffrey Epstein, through Ghislaine Maxwell, would bring young women over, young girls over, and under the guise of massage, would sexually assault them and abuse them. Next up, we got to talk about the contact book. So, At the top of this 95-page document, it says redactions for personal contact information. And let me tell you, there are a lot of redactions in this, okay? It is basically a bunch of names with their personal information either blacked out or redacted, maybe their phone numbers or addresses. I'm assuming that's what it is, but some boxes are bigger than others, so maybe there was more information about certain people rather than others. However, there are a list of names that are quite notable on this list, okay? Now, before I read up a bunch of them, remember, just because they are presumably in Jeffrey Epstein's contact book doesn't mean they're complicit in any of his alleged wrongdoing. Epstein was a very well known and well connected financier who knew a lot of people. Got to make that clear. Okay. So even though I'm about to list a lot of people, this is not the Epstein list of everybody who was involved in alleged wrongdoing or illegal activity. Okay. Now, to give you a sense of who he seemingly knew, here we go. Alec Baldwin, Ralph Fiennes, Michael Jackson, Dr. Henry A. Kissinger, Mick Jagger, David Koch, Chris Tucker, Richard Branson, Barbara Walters, Mike Wallace, Steve Wynn, Alan Dershowitz, Donald Trump, Ivanka Trump, Ivana Trump, Les Wexner, Courtney Love, Rupert Murdoch, Duchess of York, Joan Rivers, Christy Turlington, Maria Shriver, Ron Silver, Janice Dickinson, Minnie Driver, David Blaine, Phil Collins, George Hamilton, Liz Hurley, Ted Kennedy Jr., Doug Lyman, Ron Burkle, Christopher Lambert, and Ghislaine Maxwell. Now, aside from these apparent actors and musicians and magicians and journalists and politicians and wealthy individuals and business leaders, there are also a plethora of other names, but you kind of get a sense of some of the more well-known people that he apparently had their contact information. And there are also contacts for properties like various Ritz-Carltons, the Aspen Club, Bel Air Hotel, Beverly Wilshire, Cipriani, the Plaza, the Pierre. I mean, we're talking luxury places here. And the last page of this document is titled Important Email Addresses. Now, I'm not sure if this was actually crafted by a prosecutor in this case or Jeffrey Epstein or somebody connected to him, but it is interesting because one is for Jeffrey Epstein and everything next to it is redacted. But in parentheses, it appears there are initials for locations like PB, seemingly for Palm Beach, NY for New York, and so forth. Ghislaine Maxwell is listed there too. There's also one for venture capitalist Joe Pagano, Ehud Barak, former Prime Minister of Israel, Jean-Luc Brunel, talk about him in a second, David Copperfield. And then this one's interesting. Next to Christopher, it seems to say French driver. It says next to this person, important witness. Again, we don't know who wrote that, but important. Now, what is interesting about some of these names, and to kind of give you some more context, is last year when a judge released Jeffrey Epstein materials, more specifically grand jury materials, pursuant to a bill signed by Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, these materials centered around when the Palm Beach Police Department opened up an investigation into Jeffrey Epstein back in 2005 and what was presented to a grand jury in 2006. So that was when the parents of a 14-year-old girl came forward accusing Jeffrey Epstein of paying her to give him a massage. The police apparently found out that Epstein had allegedly set up a system to recruit girls to provide him massages, to sometimes engage in sexual activity. The case was brought to the state attorney's office. A grand jury was impaneled where the jurors heard all sorts of testimony from detectives, two of the alleged victims. And that grand jury ended up indicting Epstein in 2006 on felony solicitation of a prostitute. And that was it. You know, there have been long-standing arguments about this. Why didn't prosecutors pursue more aggressive charges? Why was this the only one? And of course, we know what happened, right? The Palm Beach Police Department chief and lead detective, they were partially troubled. They were particularly troubled, I should say, by this prosecution. So they referred the matter to the FBI, who then brought it to the assistant U.S. attorney. So now we're talking about the feds. But in the end, in 2008, Epstein and prosecutors, they worked out a deal where he pled guilty to state charges of solicitation of prostitution and procurement of minors. He was sentenced to just 18 months in prison, only serves 13, and spends most of the time in a work release program. He can leave jail to work at his office and then go back to jail at night, and he avoids federal charges. He had to register as a sex offender too. But this is the whole sweetheart deal that you hear a lot about in this case. And the argument is if he were hit with more severe charges back in the day, he could have been stopped from, as the allegations have explained, continuing to hurt people. Now, I say all that because we learned more information about some of the names I just mentioned in that contact book. For example, magician David Copperfield. So apparently, victims who have filed lawsuits against Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, they named David Copperfield as being present at get togethers at Jeffrey Epstein's residences. And Copperfield also allegedly asked one of the alleged victims if she knew about getting money for bringing Epstein new girls. A very interesting comment that he reportedly made. And he also allegedly performed magic for Epstein's guests. There was a message where the note taker wrote, "Magic David called." There were others with more direct connections to Epstein's supposed worldwide sex trafficking ring. Also, they show up multiple times in Epstein's call logs from that release. But somebody I just mentioned before in his contact book, French model scout Jean-Luc Brunel. He was accused of acting as a pimp for Jeffrey Epstein, procuring young girls for him to sexually assault. In a phone message, Brunel apparently said, "I need a big favor. I hope you will do it." Now, Brunel was kicked out of a modeling agency in 1999 to follow a report of a decades-long abuse against young women and girls. And Epstein and Brunel, they started a new agency. When Epstein died in 2019, by the way, French authorities, they opened up an investigation against Brunel. He tried to flee to Senegal. He was arrested at the airport. He, too, was found dead at a prison in Paris on February 19th, 2022, as he was being investigated for rape and trafficking of minors. But knowing that, he had messages in that Florida release that, when you look back, it seemed much more sinister. For example, there was a note that read, "He just did a good one, 18 years. She spoke to me and said, 'I love Jeffrey.'" Again, just talking about Brunel because, as I mentioned, he was in the contact book. Also talking about who was in the contact book, Alan Dershowitz. He was the lawyer who helped Epstein secure that sweetheart deal. I mentioned Lex Wexner, the longtime friend and fellow millionaire, the owner of Victoria's Secret. Now, he has been called out in recent years for his connection to Jeffrey Epstein, who apparently he gave control of basically a lot of his fortune, a lot of his money. And Wexner has said that he knew nothing of Epstein's alleged indiscretions and says that he himself was taken advantage of by the financier. So, putting that all to the side, moving back on to today's materials release, there's another file that we got to talk about. It is called Evidence Collected. Now, I will assume that this is evidence that was collected from one or more of Epstein's properties. And I say assume, but according to the New York Times, this is a list of the items that were seized by the feds when they searched Epstein's homes in New York and the U.S. Virgin Islands after he was arrested in 2019. And when you think about prosecutors in the Southern District of New York building a sex trafficking case against him for allegedly sexually exploiting and abusing dozens of minor girls in Manhattan, Palm Beach, Florida, and other locations, I mean, look at what they could potentially use at a trial. Look at what they potentially found, okay? CD labeled Girl Pics Nude Book 4, 4 massage tables, 1 red rope containing letter, photo album of girls, photo of islands, heat-sealed bag full of cash labeled SK with 17K plus, heat-sealed bag containing on small white envelope with writing 2000 SK with $4,400. Austrian passport with Epstein photograph. Lots of electronics like computers, iPads, recorders, hard drives. You can easily say dozens of electronics. Binder full of 68 discs. Don't know what's on those. Box containing one stuffed dog. Box containing two white and colored busts of female torsos. Box containing one brown bust sculpture of female breasts. Bundled photos and CDs from Women Old Photos box. Interesting. One red rope containing two photos of female buttocks. Five costumes and one wig. Four fried photos of naked females. One set of collar handcuffs and whip. Just basically reading what it says here. So, look, that is kind of a summary of what was released in this potential first batch. We're going to see what happens next. We'll see what Kash Patel may potentially uncover regarding other material that allegedly wasn't handed over to Pam Bondi. And I will say, look, this doesn't help the FBI's role in all of this. I mean, I spoke to Colin Schmidt, and when I did, we talked about this, but my understanding was that during Ghislaine Maxwell's trial, it was revealed that FBI agents that they raided Epstein's townhouse in New York, and evidence went missing. There were CDs, hard drives, money, jewelry, passports that the agents photographed, and then they didn't have the legal authority to seize it at that point. They ended up coming back to obtain it, and when they did, a few days later, it was apparently all gone. Last year, 8 alleged victims of Jeffrey Epstein sued the FBI over what they claim was a failure on their part to do a proper investigation into Epstein back in the 90s. So it's an important time for the FBI with essentially the country watching. And you have to imagine there's more information rather than just 200 pages. Look, I'll give you an example. Back in 2019, the FBI seized computers from his home in the Virgin Islands. What is all that digital evidence? So we'll keep an eye out. And look, I will say this in the end. No matter what comes out, I can't definitively say that there's going to be some sort of repercussions for this or criminal charges, aside from the statute of limitations issues that you might run into. You wonder what federal charges could be. Obviously, you think about this with what we've seen in these kinds of cases, conspiracy, sex trafficking, transporting minors or enticing minors for the purposes of illegal sex acts. These are things you could look out for, but I can't definitively say, based on anything that comes out, that anyone would be criminally charged. But in the interest of transparency and getting more information, definitely useful, definitely interesting. We will keep a very careful eye on what happens next. That's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Jesse Weber, and please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. We'll catch you next time.